If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. The Arizona Territory, 1879. The day had been dry and endless, the kind of day that made men question why they ever settled west of the Mississippi. The land rolled in shades of dust and yellow rock, broken only by cactus and dry brush. A lone figure moved slowly through it. A man on horseback, shoulders slightly hunched, coat flapping against the wind. Thomas Hale had been riding since dawn. His horse, a lean bay named Dust, lifted one tired hoof after another, each step leaving shallow prints in the hard ground. The saddle creaked softly with rhythm, the sound familiar and steady. Thomas's limp made long rides painful. His right leg stiffened after too many hours in the saddle, and he would sometimes shift his weight just to keep the pain from locking up his knee. He wasn't traveling for money or bounty. Not anymore. The days of working for men who wore badges or paid gold for killing were behind him. Now, he drifted town to town, ranch to ranch, trading work for food or a place to sleep. He had no family, no destination, and no one waiting on the other side of the horizon. The only thing left to him was the quiet. By late afternoon, the sun burned low and orange, cutting long shadows across the land. Thomas rode down into a dry wash to follow what used to be a stream. He was thinking about making camp before nightfall when Dust snorted and hesitated. The horse's ears twitched forward. Thomas looked ahead. At first, he thought he saw a bundle of cloth, something the wind had carried and dropped. But as he came closer, the shape took form. A fallen horse, its side torn open, and beside it, a person lying still. Thomas's heartbeat slowed and tightened. He pulled the reins gently and dismounted, his boots hitting the dry earth with a dull thud. He approached carefully, one hand near the revolver holstered at his hip. You didn't survive long in this country by assuming things were safe. The person was a woman, young, small-framed, her skin a warm bronze tone beneath the dust. Her black hair was tangled, her dress torn, and a dark patch spread across her shoulder. The bullet had gone clean through, but the bleeding had slowed. Thomas knelt beside her, scanning the horizon out of habit. The desert was empty, too quiet. He rested his hand on her arm. Her eyes opened sharply, wide and fierce. She tried to push herself up, whispering something in Apache, her voice raw and weak. "Easy," he said. "You're safe." She didn't understand, or maybe she didn't believe him. Her hand moved toward a knife still strapped to her boot. Thomas caught her wrist, firm but not rough. "Don't," he said, shaking his head. "You'll tear your wound." For a moment, they stared at each other, his face lined with fatigue and hers tight with distrust. Then her strength gave out. She fell back against the ground, breathing hard. Thomas looked at the sky. Dusk was creeping in fast. He couldn't leave her there. Even if she hated him, she wouldn't last an hour once the temperature dropped. He lifted her gently. She was lighter than he expected, and carried her to a shaded ridge where the rocks formed a half shelter from the wind. Dust followed, snorting softly. Thomas unpacked a canteen, poured water into his palm, and touched it to her lips. She flinched but then drank. Her throat moved weakly, and her breathing steadied. He spoke quietly, as much to himself as to her. "You're going to make it through the night, miss." He gathered brush and lit a small fire with a match, shielding it from the wind. The flame caught, warm and steady. He pulled a blanket from his saddlebag, draped it over her, then sat a few feet away, elbows on his knees. As darkness fell, he studied her face in the firelight. She couldn't have been older than 25. The beads on her torn dress glinted faintly. Turquoise bone, something that once meant home to her. She wasn't just wounded, she was running from something. Thomas's mind drifted back to faces he'd seen before. Apache villages burned down, soldiers laughing over whiskey, the stench of smoke and blood. He had been there once. Maybe not in her village, but in others just like it. His chest tightened at the thought. He took off his hat and rubbed his hands through his hair. "Hell," he muttered. "Maybe this is how I pay for it." She stirred and opened her eyes again, this time calmer. "Why you help?" she asked, her accent thick but words clear enough. Thomas met her gaze. Because someone should. She didn't answer. Her eyes drifted shut again, and soon her breathing slowed into shallow, steady rhythm. He watched her along while before he leaned back against the rock. The desert air cooled fast. Coyotes howled somewhere far off. He kept the revolver close to his leg, but didn't touch it. His eyelids grew heavy, but his mind stayed awake, alert to every sound, every shadow. He didn't know who she was or why she'd been shot, but that didn't matter tonight. For the first time in months, Thomas Hale wasn't just surviving the night. He was responsible for someone else's life. And that changed everything. As the firelight flickered across his face, his expression hardened, not in anger, but in resolve. He didn't have a plan yet, only a decision. He would get her somewhere safe. Tomorrow, they'd figure out the rest. The wind shifted. The smell of rain lingered faintly in the air. Somewhere beyond a ridge, a coyote barked once and went silent. Thomas pulled his coat tighter and looked at the sleeping woman again. She was still breathing. He nodded to himself. "All right," he whispered. "We'll see what the morning brings." The morning came gray and cold. The fire had burned down to a few glowing embers, and a thin layer of dust had settled over everything. The saddle, the canteen, his boots. Thomas stirred first. His body ached from sleeping against the hard ground, but habit made him rise before the sun. He stretched his bad leg until the pain dulled into something tolerable, then poured the last of his water into a tin cup to heat for coffee. When he turned toward her, the woman was awake, watching him. Her eyes were dark, still sharp, but no longer full of panic. Her wound had stopped bleeding, but the skin around it looked swollen. The blanket had slipped off her shoulders, and she pulled it back up when she saw him looking. "You made it through the night," he said, voice steady. She studied him without answering, then spoke softly, struggling with the words. "You not soldier?" Thomas shook his head. "No, haven't been one of those in a long time." Her eyes narrowed. "You wear gun." "Old habit," he said, glancing down at the revolver on his hip. "Don't use it unless I have to." Her gaze lingered on him for another moment before she turned away. He could tell she didn't trust him. He didn't blame her. Trust wasn't something that came easy out here, especially not between people like them. After they drank the coffee, Thomas packed his saddle. He checked her shoulder again. She flinched when his fingers brushed her skin, but didn't pull away. The bullet had gone clean through. She was lucky. "You'll need a doctor," he said. "There's a small town half a day's ride north." "No town," she said quickly, shaking her head. He looked at her, waiting for an explanation. "Soldiers there," she added. "White men." He sighed, running a hand over his jaw. "Then you tell me where you want to go." She hesitated. "West." "West is empty," he said. "Nothing but wind and sun." Her reply came quiet but firm, "Better than men." That answer settled it. He didn't push. He'd known the kind of fear that made a person choose empty land over human company. He lifted her carefully onto his horse and walked beside, dust instead of riding. The pace was slow, the silence heavy but not hostile. As the sun climbed, heat shimmered across the land. The woman, Naeli, she had said her name, was held onto the saddle horn with one hand, the other pressed against her shoulder. Every few minutes, Thomas glanced up to check if she was still awake. She kept her eyes on the horizon, refusing help even when she wobbled. By midday, they reached a dry canyon rim. Thomas stopped, studying the land below, a scattered line of dead cottonwoods, an old windmill, and the remains of a small ranch. He'd passed it once before, years back, when it still had a roof and a corral. "There," he said, pointing, "we'll rest down there. Water's still good, far as I remember." They reached it by late afternoon. The ranch was half gone, eaten by wind and time. One wall of the main house still stood straight. The others leaned, patched by years of dust storms. Thomas pushed the door open, the hinges groaning. Inside smelled of wood rot and mice, but the fireplace and stone floor were solid. He cleared a corner, spread out a bedroll, and helped her sit. "You stay here," he said. "I'll get water." She watched him go without answering. Outside, he found the old well and cranked up a bucket. The water came up cool and clear. He filled the canteens, then looked toward the horizon. flat land stretching forever, nothing but wind and the faint shimmer of heat. He felt a strange relief knowing there was nothing out there chasing them. When he returned, she had fallen asleep again, her face turned toward the light spilling through a broken shutter. For a moment, he stood there watching her. She looked younger in sleep, tired but peaceful. He noticed the necklace around her neck, small turquoise beads threaded with sinew. Handmade, old, worn smooth by time. A family piece, maybe. A reminder of somewhere she couldn't go back to. He built a small fire and cooked beans from his pack. When the smell filled the air, her eyes opened. "You cook?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said, stirring the pot. She nodded slightly, almost approving. "Smells good." They ate in silence. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass, making a sound like faint whispers. When she finished, she leaned back against the wall, eyes heavy with exhaustion. He thought she'd fallen asleep again, but then she spoke. "You saved me." "Why?" Thomas paused, setting his tin plate down. "Because no one else was going to." "Not fear I kill you?" she asked. He half smiled. "If you wanted to, you would have done it already." That made her look at him for a long time. Something softened in her expression. Not trust yet, but maybe the first small piece of it. Night came fast. Thomas added more wood to the fire and sat with his back to the wall, hat pulled low. He listened to the wind outside, the faint crackle of burning logs, the slow rhythm of her breathing. His thoughts drifted again, to the wars, to the orders he'd followed, to the look of faces that never left his mind. He wondered if any man ever truly left that behind, or if it just buried itself deep enough to be quiet. He looked toward Naeli again. She was asleep, her hand resting over the turquoise beads at her neck. For the first time since he'd found her, she didn't look like someone running. He leaned his head back, eyes half closed, and whispered to the room, though no one was listening, "You're safe now." Outside, the desert wind shifted direction. The firelight flickered across the walls of the old house, turning the broken wood into something that almost looked alive again. It wasn't much, but for two lost souls who had nowhere else to go, it was a beginning. And for Thomas Hale, that was enough reason to stay through the night. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that neither of them planned, but both quietly accepted. Morning started early, before the heat rose, with Thomas checking the well and feeding dust while Naeli cleaned the small room they had claimed inside the half-collapsed ranch house. The air still smelled of dust and old timber, but it was a roof. And for now, that meant safety. Naeli's wound began to heal, though slowly. She could lift her arm higher each day, but the pain still caught her if she moved too fast. Thomas noticed how stubborn she was about it. She refused help even when her hand shook, trying to tie the bandage herself. He didn't argue. He'd learned that sometimes silence earned more trust than words. He had seen the kind of people who carried themselves like she did. Eyes that stayed sharp even when tired, shoulders held tight as if bracing for the next blow. She wasn't just surviving, she was preparing. When she slept, she sometimes whispered in her language. Words he couldn't understand, but the tone was soft, like speaking to someone long gone. He guessed she was talking to family. By the fourth morning, she was strong enough to help. He handed her an empty bucket and pointed toward the well. "Think you can manage that?" She stared at it, then at him. "You watch me," she said. "I'll be right here," he replied. She walked to the well, filled it slowly, and carried the bucket back with effort. He didn't step in to take it from her, even though it would have been easier. She wanted to do it herself, and he respected that. When she set it down, her hands trembled slightly. "You did fine," he said simply. Her lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close. That afternoon, a sandstorm rose without warning. The wind howled through the canyon, turning the sky into a wall of yellow and gray. Thomas pulled boards over the open windows while Naeli held the blankets against the cracks in the wall. Dust blew in anyway, covering everything in a thin, gritty film. When it was over, the ranch was half buried, the horizon blurred in the heavy stillness that followed. Thomas stood outside, scanning the land. He felt an old tension rise in him, the same feeling that used to come before an ambush. Empty land never meant safety. He turned back toward the house and saw her standing by the doorway, watching him. You look like waiting for someone, she said. He gave a short, humorless laugh. Not anymore. Her head tilted slightly. You lose people? He nodded once. Yeah. Family, she pressed. He hesitated. Wife and boy. Fever took them long ago. It wasn't something he talked about. The words felt strange in his mouth, like they belonged to another man. But the silence between them had grown honest enough that saying it didn't hurt as much as he expected. She looked at him quietly, the wind tugging strands of her hair loose. Then why you stay alone? He shrugged. Because I got used to it. She didn't answer right away. Alone is heavy, she said finally. That night, they sat by the fire again. The wind had calmed, and the flames made soft light across the cracked walls. She was sewing a torn sleeve of her dress, the needle moving carefully through the fabric. Thomas cleaned his rifle piece by piece, though he hadn't used it in months. It was more habit than need, a way to keep his hands busy when his thoughts started circling back to things he didn't want to remember. She broke the silence first. You kill Indians before? She asked. The question hit him harder than he expected. He froze for a second, the cleaning cloth still in his hand. He didn't look at her when he answered. Yes, he said quietly. A long time ago, I rode with a company out of Prescott. Thought we were doing the right thing. She kept sewing, her hand steady. You still think that? He shook his head. No. For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound of the fire and the wind moving outside. Then she said, the men who burned my village wore blue coats. One had a white horse and gold badge. Her eyes lifted to his. You know that kind? He swallowed hard. I knew plenty of them, but I don't ride with those men anymore. Something passed between them then, a quiet acknowledgement that couldn't be spoken aloud. The past was sitting between them, heavy but shared. The following morning, she found him outside, sitting on the porch step, holding a small wooden carving in his hand. It was old, smooth from years of being carried. She pointed to it. What that? My boy made it, he said, his voice softer. A horse. Used to keep it in my pocket when I was working cattle. Guess I still do. She looked at it for a while, then said, you keep him close that way. Yeah, he said. Something like that. In the days after, their silence changed. It wasn't the guarded kind anymore. She began to hum softly while she worked. He didn't ask what the songs meant, but he found himself listening. Sometimes he caught her looking out toward the hills, face tight with thought. Once she asked, you believe people can fix what's broken? He thought about it before answering. No, he said finally, but they can live with it. That night, he dreamed of his old home, a ranch much like this one, before sickness took it all. When he woke, the sun was barely up, and Nayeli was outside feeding dust. She looked smaller against the vast sky, but stronger somehow too. He watched her for a long moment before stepping outside. We'll need supplies soon, he said. There's a town east of here. If we go careful, maybe no one bothers us. She nodded. I come. He studied her expression, the calm determination in her eyes. Whatever she was running from, she wasn't running anymore. She was planning. Thomas didn't ask what she meant to do when they reached that town. Some questions didn't need to be asked yet. For now, the silence between them said enough. Two people carrying ghosts, learning how to breathe again under the same roof. And though neither would admit it aloud, the ranch no longer felt like a hiding place. It was starting to feel like something else entirely, something worth staying for. By the time winter reached the desert, the light changed. Days were shorter, the sky clearer, the cold sharper. The air carried the smell of dry sage and wood smoke, and nights turned so still that the faintest sound, the crack of cooling timber, the distant coyote call, felt loud enough to fill the empty land. The small ranch house had become more than a shelter by then. It had turned into a fragile kind of home. The holes in the roof were patched with planks Thomas scavenged from the barn, and the old stone fireplace burned every evening with mesquite branches Nayeli gathered during the day. They had settled into a rhythm that felt quiet but steady. Thomas hunted rabbits and trapped small game in the draws behind the canyon. Nayeli cooked and washed, her movements slow but purposeful. Her shoulder had healed, leaving only a faint scar. She still wore her turquoise necklace, and every time Thomas saw it, he thought about how it must be the only piece she had left from her family. He never asked. He didn't need to. Their conversations were rare, but carried weight when they happened. He had learned that she didn't like talking about the past, and he respected that. Still, sometimes, when the fire was low and the night long, she would speak a little, short fragments of memory, like pieces of a broken mirror. A brother who used to carve animals from wood. A mother who sang while grinding maize. The sound of horses at dawn before soldiers came. She never cried when she said these things. Her voice stayed steady, almost too steady. Thomas didn't interrupt or try to comfort her. He knew how words could make some wounds worse. He just listened, quietly adding another log to the fire when it burned low. One morning, while repairing a fence behind the barn, Thomas noticed hoofprints, fresh, deeper than his horse's. He crouched to study them. Whoever had passed through was riding fast, and recent rain had softened the ground enough to leave clear tracks. He followed them to the edge of the ridge, but saw nothing else. When he returned, Naeli was standing by the doorway, holding the rifle he'd left inside. "Someone come?" she asked. "Maybe just passing through," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. She handed him the rifle, eyes steady. "You think they look for me?" He met her gaze. "Could be. Or they could be just drifters." She nodded once, her expression unreadable. "Then we stay quiet." That evening, Thomas sat outside until the stars came out, the rifle resting across his knees. The desert night was calm again, but his thoughts weren't. He'd promised himself he'd left danger behind, but something about this woman kept pulling him toward it again. Inside, Naeli moved around the room, tending to the fire. She looked at him through the cracked doorway, her face half lit by the flickering glow. "You worry too much," she said. He smiled faintly. "That's what keeps people alive." "Sometimes it keeps people alone," she replied. Her words hit harder than she knew. He thought of his wife and son, the sickness that took them fast, the months after when the silence of the house had nearly broken him. He realized how long it had been since anyone had spoken to him with concern instead of pity. Later, when he came inside, she was sitting on the floor by the fire, her hair loose and unbraided for the first time. It caught the firelight in soft lines, and for a moment he stopped, unsure how to move or what to say. She noticed him watching. "You look like you see ghosts," she said quietly. He shook his head. "No ghost, just a person." She turned her gaze back to the fire. "Then you lucky. I see ghosts every night." The room fell silent. He sat beside her, not too close, but near enough to share the warmth. They stayed like that for a while, the sound of burning would filling the space between them. Eventually, she leaned back against the wall, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. Before she closed them, she said softly, "You could leave, you know. I not stop you." "I know," he answered. "You stay why?" He thought for a long time. "Because I don't want to ride alone anymore." When she fell asleep, he watched her for a few moments, the rise and fall of her breathing, the calmness that came over her face when she was finally resting. Then he lay down across from her, staring at the cracked ceiling until the fire dimmed to embers. For the first time in years, sleep came easy. The next morning, frost covered the windows. Dust snorted near the barn, his breath clouding in the cold air. Thomas stepped outside and exhaled steam, feeling the bite of winter on his skin. The sky was pale blue, cloudless. He stood there a moment, listening to the world breathe. We went back inside. Naeli was awake and stirring coffee. "Cold," she said. He nodded. "Gets worse from here." "Then we need more wood," she said, pulling on her coat. He frowned. "You don't have to." She cut him off with a sharp look. "I can work." And she did. Together they hauled wood until midday, their breaths visible in the freezing air. He noticed the small things then, the way she stopped to let him rest when his limp slowed him down, the way she smiled faintly when dust nuzzled her shoulder. They worked side by side without speaking much, but there was an ease between them that hadn't been there before. That night, as the fire burned high and the wind beat against the house, Thomas caught her humming again. It wasn't a sad tune this time. It was low, steady, almost comforting. He watched her from his chair, her hands moving over a piece of cloth she was stitching into a new sleeve for him. "You don't have to do that," he said. She didn't look up. "I know." "Then why?" "Because someone should," she said, echoing the same words he'd told her that first night in the desert. He stared at her quietly, the words sinking deeper than she could have known. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled, and outside, snow began to fall in slow, quiet flakes, dusting the desert in white. By the time they went to sleep, the storm had covered the ground completely. Inside the old house, the light from the dying fire flickered softly across their faces. It was no longer the same silence they had shared when they met. It was warmer now, something earned, something human. And though neither of them said aloud, both knew the same truth in that quiet. Whatever came next, they wouldn't be facing it alone anymore. The snow melted fast when spring came, leaving behind patches of wet earth and grass that gleamed under the morning sun. The air carried a new warmth, mixed with the smell of damp soil and pine. The days had started to stretch again, and with them came a quiet restlessness neither of them could ignore. Thomas noticed it first in her eyes. Naeli had grown calmer over the winter, more talkative, more open, but in the last few days something had shifted. She moved with purpose again. Her silence wasn't the kind that came from fear anymore, it came from decision. He found her standing near the corral early one morning, her hand resting on Dust's neck. She turned when she heard his steps, her face composed, but her eyes holding that same heavy fire he'd seen when they first met. "I need to find him," she said. Thomas didn't ask who. He already knew. "The man on the white horse," she continued. "The one who led them when they burned my home. Someone said he went to Tucson." He took a long breath, looking past her toward the horizon. "That's a long ride, Naeli. Dangerous, too." "I rode longer to stay alive," she replied. Thomas hesitated, adjusting the strap of his holster. He had spent years trying to leave the life of guns and blood behind, but the look on her face told him that this was no longer about violence. It was about peace, the kind a person couldn't find until the past stopped chasing them. "You plan to kill him?" he asked. Her jaw tightened. "I plan to look at him. After that, I don't know." He nodded slowly. "Then I'm going with you." "You don't have to." "I know," he said, "but I'm still going." They packed light, dried meat, water, a blanket each. Thomas left the ranch door unlatched. He didn't say it aloud, but he meant to come back. They rode out at dawn. The desert spread wide and quiet before them. The air still carried the bite of winter in the shadows, but the sun promised change. The road to Tucson took 4 days. They avoided main trails, moving through canyons and dry riverbeds. At night, they camped under the open sky. The stars felt close enough to touch, the wind cold against their faces. Thomas stayed awake long after she slept, watching the horizon, listening to the sound of her breathing and the crackle of the fire. He wondered what she would do when they found the man, and what he would do if she couldn't. On the second night, as the fire burned low, Naeli spoke without looking up. "You think killing makes the pain stop?" Thomas stared into the flames. "No, but it changes what the pain means." She was quiet for a long moment. "You kill many?" "Too many," he admitted. She looked at him then, her face calm. "You hate yourself for it." He nodded once. "Good," she said softly. "Means you still human." By the time they reached the edge of Tucson, the land had turned dry again, the grass replaced by dust and mesquite. The military post stood on the hill, whitewashed walls, a flag snapping in the wind. From a distance, it looked small, harmless. But Naeli's hands were trembling when she saw it. "That's him?" Thomas asked. She pointed toward a man standing near the stables, giving orders to 2 soldiers. His uniform was pressed, his boots clean, his voice sharp even from afar. "That's him," she said, her voice low but steady. Thomas studied her expression. The rage was there, but something else too. Grief, hesitation, the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying a burden too long. "What are you going to do?" he asked quietly. She gripped the rifle in her hands, then let out a shaky breath. "I thought I would shoot him. Now I don't know if that makes anything right." They watched as the officer mounted his horse and rode down the dirt road toward the market. The world felt still for a moment, just the wind, the dust, and the sound of hoofbeats fading into distance. Thomas touched her arm gently. "If you go down there, there's no coming back from it. You know that." She looked up at him. "And if I don't?" "Then you still get to live," he said. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Naeli lowered the rifle. Her fingers trembled as she handed it to him. "He doesn't get to have my life, too," she said. Thomas nodded, a small relief breaking through the weight on his chest. "Then let's go home." They turned their horses around and rode away, the forge shrinking behind them until it disappeared completely into the horizon. For the first time since he'd known her, she looked lighter, not happy, not yet, but unburdened. That night, they camped near a shallow creek. The fire burned softly, and she sat beside him, knees drawn close. "You think he ever remembers what he did?" she asked. "Maybe," he said, "but even if he doesn't, you don't need to carry his sin anymore." She looked into the flames, her voice quiet. "My brother's name was Tioni. He was 15. He wanted to be a hunter." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then he deserved better men than us running this land." She looked at him, her eyes wet but steady. "You're not like them." He gave a small, tired smile. "Used to be." She reached out then, resting her hand on his arm, just once lightly. "Not now." Neither of them said anything more that night. The stars moved slowly across the black sky, and the fire sank to glowing embers. They both knew they couldn't undo what had happened, but maybe they had finally stopped being trapped by it. When morning came, the world was clear again. The sun rose over the desert in gold and white, and for the first time in years, Thomas didn't feel the need to keep riding. They turned their horses toward the north, toward the old ranch that waited for them like something half-remembered but worth rebuilding. As they rode side by side, the wind moved through the grass, carrying away the last of what they didn't need to say. The road back to the ranch took nearly a week. The land had turned green again, small patches of wild grass rising where the winter snow had once lain heavy. Spring rain had washed the dust from the air, and the desert felt softer, almost forgiving. The trail they followed was the same one they had taken months ago, but it didn't feel like the same journey. Neither of them spoke much, yet the silence between them carried a quiet ease that hadn't been there before. When they finally crested the ridge overlooking the valley, the ranch came into view. The sight stopped them both for a moment. The house still stood crooked against the horizon, the roof patched with rough boards, the fences leaning under the weight of wind and time. But smoke was still in the chimney from the embers they had left banked before leaving, and Thomas's horse whinnied softly at the familiar smell of home. He looked over at Naeli. She was staring at the place, her eyes unreadable. "You sure this is where you want to be?" he asked. She nodded once. "It's quiet here." He smiled faintly. "Yeah, quiet's not so bad." They unpacked their things, worked through the day repairing what winter had taken. The rhythm of it felt natural now. Him fixing the fence line, her clearing the garden bed behind the house. The ache in his leg flared by evening, and she noticed. Without saying anything, she brought him a cup of water and left it beside him on the porch step. He looked up, and she met his eyes with a small, knowing smile. Inside the house, life began to take a shape again. She washed the windows with rainwater until they caught the light differently, softer, clearer. He replaced the hinges on the door, rebuilt the table that had collapsed in the cold. Neither of them said it aloud, but everything they touched was an act of claiming this place. Not as refuge anymore, but as something real, something meant to last. At night, the fire burned strong. They sat across from each other, the sound of wind outside replaced by the calm crackle of burning wood. Thomas leaned back in his chair, the brim of his hat tilted low. Naeli sat sewing near the light, her movements calm, unhurried. For the first time, her hands didn't shake. The storm that had lived in her seemed to have gone quiet. He watched her for a while before speaking. "You think about him?" "The officer." She paused for a moment, then nodded. "Sometimes, but not with fire anymore. Just memory. That's how it starts to fade," he said. She glanced up. "Do your ghosts fade?" He thought for a long moment. "Not all. Some just get quieter. You learn to live with them." The wind shifted outside, carrying the faint smell of rain again. She set her sewing aside and leaned her elbows on the table. "I was thinking," she said slowly, "about building another small room. Maybe for tools, or for sleeping when it's too hot inside." He smiled. "You planning to stay that long?" Her answer was simple. "I stay." The words landed softly, but meant everything. He nodded once, as if sealing the decision between them. Then I guess I'll make sure the roof holds. Over the next few weeks, the place came alive in ways Thomas hadn't thought possible anymore. Dust grazed in the open field, healthier than before. The small patch of ground Naeli tended began to sprout green. Herbs, beans, corn, tiny signs of growth in a place that had once felt empty. She worked barefoot in the soil, her laughter faint but real when the wind blew her hair loose. Thomas repaired the barn doors and oiled the hinges on the corral gate. He caught himself humming sometimes without meaning to. It startled him the first time it happened, a small, thoughtless sound of contentment. He didn't stop it after that. One afternoon, as the sun dropped low and the light turned gold, Naeli sat on the porch steps sharpening a knife. She looked up as Thomas came from the field carrying a bundle of wood. "You walk easier now," she said. "Legs not as stiff," he replied. "You think it ever heal?" He shrugged. "Maybe not, but it carries me far enough." She nodded. "Same with the heart." He looked at her then, really looked, at the scar on her shoulder that no longer seemed angry, at the calm in her face, the steady strength in her eyes. There was no trace of the frightened woman he'd found in the desert. She had turned that pain into something quiet and solid, the same way he had turned guilt into care. When night came, they ate by firelight. Outside, crickets chirped, and the faint sound of the wind moved through the canyon. Thomas leaned back, staring at the flames. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked. She smiled softly. "Tomorrow comes. We wake. We work. That's enough." He nodded. "Yeah, that's enough." Later, when the fire dimmed, she stood and walked to the door. The moonlight spilled in through the open frame, silvering the floorboards. She turned back toward him. "You could have left me that night," she said. "Why didn't you?" He thought about it, searching for the right words. "Because I was tired of riding away." She smiled, a real one this time. "Then don't." "I won't," he said. She stepped closer, stopped beside his chair. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she reached out, her hand resting gently over his. Her touch was steady, her skin warm. He didn't move away. The world outside fell silent. The kind of silence that wasn't lonely anymore, just peaceful. They sat like that until the fire went out and the first light of dawn began to touch the edge of the hills. The desert was quiet, but alive. The same land that had once taken everything from them now gave something back. When the sun finally broke over the ridge, Thomas stood and opened the door wider, letting the light spill across the floor. Naeli came to stand beside him, her hand brushing his arm. They looked out together, the old ranch, the green shoots, the open sky stretching forever. After a long silence, he said quietly, "Guess we made it." She nodded. "We did, and that was it. No running, no ghosts left to chase, no debts unpaid. Just the sound of the wind, the warmth of the sun, and two people who had finally stopped searching for a place to belong. They had found it, right where they decided to stay."